Camera 1, Camera 2, check, check. Chapter 4, the nature of the two worlds. In the first chapter, I drew attention to the divided nature of the brain and suggested it had a purpose. Perhaps there were things that needed to be kept apart. I also drew attention to the brain's asymmetry, a suggestion that difference did not necessarily involve equality. In the second chapter, I looked at what the nature of the differences between the hemispheres might be. In the third chapter, I suggested that the hemispheres were not just randomly assorted data banks, but had coherent and possibly irreconcilable sets of values, imagined in the left hemisphere's control of manipulation through the right hand, and the evolution of language out of music, with language coming to reside largely in the left hemisphere, and music largely in the right. In this chapter, I will look in greater detail at the kinds of world the two hemispheres bring into being. I raise the question whether they really are symmetrical, or whether one takes precedence. To begin with, let's return to attention, where we began our exploration of hemisphere difference. Our attention is responsive to the world. There are certain modes of attention which are naturally called forth by certain kinds of object. We pay a different sort of attention to a dying man from the sort of attention we'd pay to the sunset or a carburetor. Is that a food or engine part? However, the process is reciprocal. It is not just that we find... Sorry, it's a bit awkward because of them. However, the process is reciprocal. It is not just that we... Fuck. Shit. However, the process is reciprocal. It is not just that what we find determines the nature of the attention we accord to it, but that the attention we pay to anything also determines what it is we find. In special circumstances, the dying man may become for a pathologist a textbook of disease, or a photojournalist a shot, both in the sense of a perceived frozen visual moment and a round of ammunition in a campaign. Attention is a moral act. It creates, brings aspects of things into being, but in doing so makes others recede. What a thing is depends on who is attending to it and in what way. The fact that a place is special to someone because of its great peace and beauty may, by that very fact, make it for another a resource to exploit. In such a way that its peace and beauty are destroyed, attention has consequences. One way of putting this is to say that we neither discover an objective reality nor invent a subjective reality, but there is a process of responsive evocation. The world calling forth something in me that in turn calls forth something in the world. The world calling forth something in me that in turn calls forth something in the world. That is true of perceptual qualities, not just of values. If there is no real mountain, for example, separate from the one created by the hopes, aspirations, reverence, or greed of those who approach it, it is equally true that its greenness or greyness or stoniness lies not in the mountain or in my mind, but comes from between us, called forth from each and equally dependent on both. As music arises from neither the piano nor the pianist's hands, the sculpture neither from hand nor stone, but from their coming together. And then the hands are a part of the lived body, or, put more conventionally, are the vehicle of the mind, which is in turn the product of all the other minds that have interacted with it, from Beethoven and Michelangelo down to every encounter of our daily lives. We are transmitters, not originators. Our attention is responsive to the world, but the world is responsive to our attention. The situation presents a paradox for linear analysis, like M.C. Escher's hand that draws the hand that draws the hand, that draws the hand that draws that. For the visual people watching, That's what he's referring to. This paradox applies to the problem. This paradox applies to the problem of how we get to know anything, but is peculiarly problematic for the special case whereby we are seeking to approach the very process whereby knowledge itself comes into being. It is not possible to discuss the very neuropsychological basis of our awareness of the world without adopting a philosophical position, whether or not one is conscious of doing so. Not to be aware of doing so is implicitly to have adopted the default standpoint of the scientific materialism. Unfortunately, according to this position, one of the hands in Escher's picture must come first. Neuropsychology is inextricably bound up with philosophy. In recent years, this has been increasingly recognized, more by philosophers than by neuroscientists, with one or two important exceptions. Some of these developments are very much to be welcomed. However, all too often there is a potentially treacherous, because undetected, process at work. What science is actually doing when it delivers its revelations goes unexamined. The scientific process and the meaning of its findings is generally taken for granted. The model of the body, and therefore the brain, tells us the model of the body, and therefore the brain, as a mechanism is exempted from the process of philosophical skepticism. What it tells us becomes the truth, and since the brain is equated with the mind too becomes a mechanism. The philosophical worldview is brought into line with that, and reveals the truth of the mechanical model as applied to brain and mind. As a result, in a spectacular hijack, instead of a mutually shaping process, whereby philosophy interrogates science and science informs philosophy, the naive worldview of science has tended by default to shape and direct what has been called neurophilosophy. If the world of the left hemisphere and the world of the right hemisphere are both present to the mind and form coherent aspects of experience, should we expect to find the resultant incompatibilities reflected in the history of philosophy? The hemispheres have different answers to the fundamental question, what is knowledge? As discussed in the last chapter, and hence different truths about the world. So on the face of it, yes. But the default approach of philosophy is that of the left hemisphere. But the default approach of philosophy is that of the left hemisphere, since it is via denotative language and But the default approach of philosophy is that of the left hemisphere, since it is via a denotative language and linear sequential analysis that we pin things down and make them clear and precise. And pinning them down and making them clear and precise equates with seeing the truth, as far as the left hemisphere is concerned. And since the type of attention you bring to bear dictates the world you discover and the tools you use to determine what you would find, it would not be surprising if philosophical vision of reality reflected the tools it uses, those of the left hemisphere, and conceived the world along analytic and purely rationalistic lines. It would be unlikely for philosophy to be able to get beyond its own terms of reference and its own epistemology, and so the answer to the question whether the history of philosophy would reflect the incompatibilities of the hemispheres is probably not. If there were, however, evidence that, despite this, philosophers had increasingly felt compelled to try give an account of the right hemisphere's reality rather than the left's, that would be of extraordinary importance. Admittedly, trying to achieve it all using the conventional tools of philosophy would be a bit like trying to fly using a submarine, all the while making ingenious adaptations to the design and to enable one to get a foot or two above the water. The odds against success would be huge, but the attempt alone would be indicative that there was something compelling beyond the normal terms of reference that forced one to make the attempt. This would be far stronger evidence for the ultimate reality of the right hemisphere's world than any amount of philosophy that confirmed the left hemisphere's reality, which would be only to be expected. What I shall argue in this chapter is that precisely such a development has in fact occurred in philosophy, and that it has been evident in the work of the most influential philosophers of our age. Such a development seems to me as striking as the developments in mathematics and physics since the 1880s, to which it is, in some important respects, a parallel. It is hardly surprising that scientific method for a long time led to a vision of the universe, the Newtonian universe, which reflected the principles of the scientific method. But when it began to compel conclusions incompatible with the model assumed by its method, a paradoxical universe, that was a more revealing finding. In the late 19th century, George Canton struggled with the idea that there was a necessary uncertainty and incompleteness to the realm of mathematics. Infinity was no longer tameable by turning it into an abstract concept, giving it a name and then carrying on as though it were just another number. He came to the realization that there is not just one infinity, but an infinity of infinities, beyond anything we can capture or represent. Something that was real, not just taking series as far as they will go, but beyond. Something other in nature than the series that tried to reach it, and that it could in principle never be reached by any kind of known cognitive process. His contemporary Ludwig Boltzmann introduced time and probability into the timeless and certain realm of physics, showing that no system can be perfect. Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems prove that what would always inevitably be the case, that there will always be truths within any system that cannot be proved in terms of that system. Niels Bohr's Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics and Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle establish a universe in which uncertainty is at the core, not just a product of human imperfection to be remedied in time by advances in learning, but in the very nature of things. Though the insight or intuition that led them to these discoveries came, I suggest, from the right hemisphere, or from both hemispheres working together, in every case their conclusions followed clearly from the left hemisphere process, the logic of sequential analysis. These transformative developments, nonetheless, validate the world as given by the right hemisphere, not the left. To return to philosophy and the brain, we should expect them to illuminate one another. Philosophy should help us understand the nature of the brain, and the nature of the brain should help to illuminate philosophical problems. There are three questions in particular worth asking here. Has what we know about the hemispheres anything to offer in illuminating philosophical debate? Equally, does philosophy help make sense of the hemisphere differences we know exist? And what can the answers to both questions tell us about the nature of the brain? The first question takes us into a deep water immediately. Philosophers themselves will be the best judges, and the issues are as extensive and complex as the mind itself. However, some possible areas for discussion naturally suggest themselves. In Western philosophy, for much of the last 2,000 years, the nature of reality has been treated in terms of dichotomies, real versus ideal, subjective versus objective. Over time, the meanings of the terms, and sometimes the terms themselves, have changed, and the constant need to transcend such dichotomies has led to modifications and qualifications of the kind of realism or idealism, the type of objectivism or subjectivism. But the essential issue has remained. How are we trying to connect the world and our minds? Since our world is brought into being by two hemispheres, which can constitute reality in profoundly different ways, it might seem likely that some of these dichotomies could be illuminated by the differences between the worlds of each of these cerebral hemispheres bring into being. It has nothing to do with the idea that, for example, one hemisphere might be subjective and the other might be objective. That's obviously untrue. Rather, the point is that philosophy in the West is essentially a left hemisphere process. It is verbal and analytical, requiring abstracted, decontextualized, disembodied thinking, dealing in categories, concerning itself with the nature of the general rather than the particular, and adopting a sequential, linear approach to truth. Building the edifice of knowledge from the parts, brick by brick. While such a characterization is not true of most pre-Socratic philosophers, particularly Heraclitus. It is at least true of the majority of philosophers since Plato in the West until the 19th century, when, for example, Schopenhauer, Hegel, and Nietzsche began to question the basis on which philosophy made its advances. Philosophy is naturally given, therefore, to a left hemisphere version of the world, in which such divides as that between the subject and the object seems especially problematic. But these dichotomies may depend on a certain naturally dichotomizing either or worldview, and may cease to be problematic in the world delivered by the right hemisphere, where what appears to be the left hemisphere to be divided is unified, where concepts are not separate from experience, and where grounding role of betweenness is in constituting reality is apparent. The key to such philosophical dichotomies lies not then, I suggest, in the division between the hemispheres, but within the nature of the left hemisphere itself. If one had to characterize the left hemisphere by reference to one governing principle, it would be that of division. Manipulation and use require clarity and fixity, and clarity and fixity require separation and division. What is moving and seamless, a process becomes static and separate. Things. It is the hemisphere of either or. Clarity yields sharp boundaries, and so it makes divisions that may not exist according to the right hemisphere, just as an individual object is neither just out there. So the self is never just a bundle of mental states of faculties, nor on the other hand, something distinct underlying them. It is an aspect of experience that perhaps has no sharp edges. Heraclitus, like the Oriental philosophers who influenced Greek thought until Plato, was unperturbed by paradox, taking it as a sign that our ordinary ways of thinking are not adequate to the nature of reality, but around the same that the Platonic mode of discourse, with its insistence on the law of the excluded middle, came into play. As in other words, thinking became philosophy in the accepted sense. Paradox started to emerge as a focus of intellectual disquiet. Some of the most famous are paradoxes. The Sorites paradox, from Greek soros, a heap, thought to have originated with Eublibus and Miltes, 350 BC. If one grain of sand is not a heap, and at no stage adding one more grain of sand is going to make the difference between a heap and being a heap, how can it ever be that, for example, the time 100,000 grains are reached, a heap has come into being? Don't get it, moving on. The ship of Theseus paradox. Plutarch wrote in his Life of Theseus. The ship wherein Theseus and the youth of Athens returned had 30 oars, and was preserved by the Athens down even to the time of the Demetrius Phalereus, for they took away the old planks as they decayed, putting in new and strong timber in their place, insomuch that this ship became a standing example among the philosophers. For the logical question of the things that grow, one side holding that ship remained the same, and the other contending that it was not the same. The reference to Demetrius Phalereus dates is from about 300 BC. The logical question of things that grow, alluded to, knowing usually as the growing argument, is the basis of numerous paradoxes, such as Chrysippus paradox, the point of being that as things grow, at least one particle is added to them or lost by them, and so according to one interpretation, they cease to be the same identity. In fact, all living things present this problem. That of a thing that flows, since they are always in a state of change and self-repair, as German philosopher Novalis was to put it 2,000 years later, there is no doubt that our body is a molded river. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that example is, if you change every plank in that ship, over time, is it the same ship? If you've slowly moved away at it, because you can view it as the same ship, but technically every material item is now a new ship. But I think that's the paradox. Xenos paradoxes originated with Zeno of Elea, 450 BC. Achilles and the tortoise. In a race in which Achilles gives the tortoise a head start, Achilles can never overtake the tortoise, because first he has to reach the point where the tortoise began, and then the point the tortoise reached while Achilles reached the tortoise starting point, and so ad infinitum. Don't get it. The dichotomy. We can never move at all because first we have to get halfway to where we're going, but before that, a quarter of the way, and before that, an eighth, and so ad infinitum. Help. The arrow. An arrow fired at a target cannot move because at any one moment, the arrow either is where it is or it is where it is not. If it remains where it is, then it must be standing still. But if it moves where it is not, it cannot be there, so it cannot move at all. The Epimenides paradox, named after Epimenides or Epimenides of Knossos, 600 BC, a possibly mythological Cretan seer who wrote in a light-hearted poem or song that Cretans are always liars. False if true, true if false. Cretan are always liars. The Epimenides paradox, named after Epimenides of Knossos, 600 BC, a possibly mythological Cretan seer who wrote in a light-hearted poem or song that Cretans are always liars. False if true, true if false. It seemed that this is only started to look like a real problem when examined retrospectively by later Greek writers. Looked at with an understanding of the different worlds disclosed by the two hemispheres, the development of paradox starts to make sense, which then conflicts with the right hemisphere. There is a sudden obtrusion of the left hemisphere's take on reality, which then conflicts with the right hemisphere. Take the Sorites paradox. This results from believing that the whole is the sum of the parts and can be reached by the sequential process of incrementation. It tries to relate two things, a grain of sand and a heap, as though their relationship was transparent. It also presupposes that there must be either a heap or not be a heap at any one time, either or, and your only alternatives are your only alternative. That is the left hemisphere's view, and sure enough, it leads to paradox. According to the right hemisphere's view, it is a matter of a shift in context and the coming into being of a gestalt, an entity which has imprecisely defined bounds and is recognized whole. The heap comes into being gradually and is a process, an evolving, changing thing. This problem is related to the growing argument. Failure to take into account context, inability to understand gestalt forms, and inappropriate demand for the precision where none can be found, and ignorance of process, which becomes a never-ending series of static moments. These are signs of the left hemisphere predominance. Or the ship of Theseus. Here again, the problem is caused by a belief that the whole is the sum of the parts. The problem is caused by the belief that the whole is the sum of the parts and disappears as the parts change. There is also a belief that there must necessarily come a point in a process where identity changes. The fact that this type of paradox was known as the growing argument, or synonymous logos, demonstrates that there is a difficulty here in dealing with all living, changing forms. All, once more, points to a dominance of the left hemisphere view over that of the right. Xenos paradoxes similarly rest on the adoption of the left hemisphere's view that every flowing motion in space or time can be resolved into a series of static moments or points that can then be summed to give back to the living whole. The seamless fluidity of motion in space or time is reduced to a series akin to the series of still frames in a cine film. This is what happens to subjects who suffer right hemisphere damage and develop palinopsia. This fragmentation of experience is also what underlies delusional misidentification, another right hemisphere deficit syndrome, where the seamlessness, the individual quiddity of a living being is broken down into a series of manifestations, taking us back to the growing argument. My wife one day is not the same person as my wife the next. Growing argument. This fragmentation of experience is also what underlies delusional misidentification, another right hemisphere deficit syndrome, where the seamlessness, the individual quiddity of a living being is broken down into a series of manifestations, taking us back to the growing argument. My wife one day is not the same person as my wife the next. The cretin liar paradox is a little different, but here too, the problem is caused by relying on the left hemisphere, only to construct the world. It does so by rules and with precision. Meanwhile, the right hemisphere, like Achilles in real life, overtakes the left hemisphere's tortoise in one effortless stride. Right hemisphere pragmatics mean that we know precisely what Epimenides is getting at. We don't have to get hung up on the rules. In the world, nothing is absolute, and with a lack of pedantry appropriate to the fact that his remark actually comes from a poem, and is probably humorous in intent, since he is well aware that he is a cretin, we understand that Epimenides has stepped outside of the frame for a moment to look at the people who he belongs to. In real life, one has come across people who take numerous remarks literally, or who laboriously attempt to replace understanding by the application of absolute rules and come up with a paradox. And they are usually somewhere along the Asperger spectrum. It looks like right hemisphere failure again, misunderstanding of context, lack of humor, lack of flexibility, insistence on the certainty obtained by rules. What this paradox also illuminates is that any enclosed, self-referring system the left hemisphere comes up with, if taken strictly on its own terms, self-explodes. There is a member of the system that cannot be accommodated by the system. There is always an escape route from the Hall of Mirrors if one looks hard enough. Paradox means, literally, a finding that is contrary to received opinion or expectation. That immediately alerts us, since the purveyor of received opinion and expectation is the left hemisphere. I called it a sign that our ordinary ways of thinking, those of the left hemisphere, are not adequate to the nature of reality. But, wait! Here, it seems that the left hemisphere, with its reliance on the application of logic, is stating the opposite. That it is reality that is inadequate to our ordinary ways of thinking. Contrary to a received opinion, it asserts, arrows do not move, Achilles cannot overtake the tortoise. There can never be a heap of sand. This ship is not really his ship after all. Epimenides was inevitably talking nonsense. In other words, its understanding of paradox. Is not that there must be problems in applying this kind of logic to the real world, but that the real world isn't the way we think it is because logic says so. This looks like an interesting usurpation, a swapping of roles, with the new dispensation redefining who is master and who is emissary. Problems arising from whether we see the world as a process, always in flux, or as a series of static, finished entities have inevitably persisted in philosophy. In the Middle Ages, it was acknowledged in the distinction between the world seen as natura naturans, like that, nature, naturing, doing what nature does, a process ever evolving, and to that degree unknowable, and natura naturata, nature natured, a something completed, perfect, which always implies past tense and arrest of the flow of time. Static, knowable. Spinoza was one of the few philosophers apart from Pascal between Plato and Hegel to have a strong sense of the right hemisphere world. For him, this distinction understandably had a particular importance. He also preeminently understood that the way in which the universal is attained to only via the particular. The more we understand individual things, the more we understand God. But the area in which the hemispheres and philosophy can be mutually illuminating, that is of chief interest in this book, is that of the relationship of the mind to the world. Just because of the immensity of that topic, I want to limit it by moving on to look at the things from the other end of the process and attempt my second question. What philosophy can tell us that will help us understand the hemisphere differences? Let's return to the main point of hemisphere difference: division versus coherence. Cohesion. Since the notorious Cartesian subject-object divide, philosophy has grappled with the spectre of solipsism. To know something is to encounter something other, and to know it is as separate from ourselves. If all I am certain of is my own existence, cogito ergo sum, how does one ever cross the gap? For the solipsist, there is nothing to encounter. Since we all know stems from our own mind alone, according to Wittgenstein, the solipsist is like someone who tries to make the car go faster by pushing against the dashboard from inside. There is a paradox here, too. The position is self-undermining, in that it nonetheless demands that mind, another conscious that can constitute the solipsist, as Hegel's master needs a slave in order to be a master. To use the term I requires a possibility of there being something which is not I. Otherwise, in place of all that is mind, we just get the vacuous all that is mine is mine. As Louis Sass has demonstrated in relation to the world of schizophrenic, solipsistic subjectivity on the one hand, with its fantasy of omnipotence, and alienated objectivity on the other, with its related fantasy of impotence, tend to collapse into one another, and are merely facets of the same phenomenon. Both imply isolation rather than connection. The attempt to adopt a God's eye view or view from nowhere, in Thomas Nagel's famous phrase, the position pretended by objectivism is as empty as solipsism and is ultimately indistinguishable from it in its consequences. The view from nowhere pretends to equate to a view from everywhere. What is different is the view from somewhere. Everything that we know can be known only from an individual point of view, or under one or another aspect of its existence, never in totality or perfection. Equally, what we come to know consists not of things, but of relationships, each apparently separated entity qualifying the others in which it is related. But this does not entail that there can be no reliably But this does not entail that there can be no reliably constituted shared world of experience. Because we do not experience precisely the same world does not mean that we are condemned not to meet in a world at all. We cannot take refuge in fantasies of either omnipotence or impotence. The difficult truth is less grand, that there is something apart from ourselves which can influence to some degree, and the evidence is that how we do so matters. That was a pretty confusing chapter, I'm not going to lie. Pretty happy with it. I think I'm going to probably read a bit more off camera. So it's starting to get a bit too wordy there. But let's leave it there because my brain's not braining.